Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, so today we have somebody from Amazon, and it's no other than Chuck Sigmund. So Chuck, first thing, before we do anything else, are you prepared to engage?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Let's go. So Chuck Sigmund is a senior program manager in the Amazon Leadership Institute. He is passionate about creating environments that bring out the best in learners and encourage them to fully engage and optimize their learning experience. His recent work has focused on how to use gamification, digital storytelling, and hyper-interactive scenarios to increase learner engagement. He holds a Master of Arts in Education and Training and is a Sententia Games Certified Gamification Master Craftsman. So Chuck, that's amazing. I don't know the levels by heart. I'm guessing that's the highest level of Sententia, right?
That's level 3 of the 3 levels that Sententia Games puts out.
There you go. So an absolute master in Sententia Games. So welcome to today's podcast, Chuck. And from all that stuff that we've said about you, I'm sure that I have missed quite a few things. Is there anything else you would like to point out?
No, I think the only other thing is that I'm a big gamer, and but not in terms of electronic games. I'm really into board games and card games, and really sort of looking at how games are put together and designed. And I think that's what got my passion going for gamification and applying it to learning situations.
So we'll be talking about that for sure as well. So Chuck, now that we've known some of the things about you, not all, because we'll never know everything about you. That's too invasive if you ask me. But now that we know a lot about you, can you tell us, what does a regular day with Chuck look like? We were talking in the pre-interview about your travels, etc. But if in a normal setting, perhaps maybe a regular day or week, what does it look like? What does it mean to be Chuck?
Well, I'm really fortunate in the work that I do at Amazon. I own 2 separate leadership development programs right now within the Amazon Leadership Institute. The first one is a program that's designed to help all of our frontline managers grow into leaders of leaders. So that's really kind of taking their current skill set as managers and elevating them into a more senior leadership kind of position. That's a program that we've designed. It's a completely asynchronous program, and I get to engage with our leaders offline, both in terms of regular meetings with them and also on an online situation where we post questions and we have engaging conversations. And what's great about it is we really get to leverage all of the experience and the expertise of our leaders across all of the globe. So this is for leadership development for leaders in every country that Amazon supports.
Wow.
The second program that I'm really super excited about and that I'm wanting to tell everybody about these days is a comprehensive curriculum that we're creating to elevate the technical and leadership skills of all of our site leaders globally. As you can imagine, Amazon's got literally hundreds of sites all over the world, and we have an assigned site leader at every single one of those. Some of those folks are relatively new to Amazon, and maybe they've moved in from somewhere other than the company, and a lot of them are folks who've sort of grown up within Amazon. They started in operations and then maybe became a team lead and then maybe a manager before they eventually became a site leader. And we're in the process of developing a comprehensive curriculum to help really elevate the technical and leadership skills of all of those site leaders. Some of the content that we're creating includes things like developing a mission and tenets for the site leaders, training them about how to make high velocity decisions, leading through change, delivering and sustaining results. All of those things that are sort of the non-technical, non-operational sort of factors that they really need to grow to become excellent leaders for Amazon. What's great about both of those programs for me is I get a lot of broad discretion to work with our stakeholders to design these programs so that they're not just chock full of content, right? It's not just somebody comes into a class and we speak to them and they walk away and hopefully they learn some of it and maybe they don't take any of it away. Um, but we're designing programs that are really exciting and hopefully engaging for the participants. So I get to spend a lot of my time every day just thinking about kind of what's the best way of helping our leaders approach problems with a new perspective, and how can we help bring them a different viewpoint that they can then take back to their sites and really grow their staff and their employees and even continually develop themselves.
Wow, that sounds very, very exciting. So Chuck, now that we've seen all these amazing things that you're doing in Amazon and all this exciting stuff, all the ups that you've been having, we would also like to know something around a different type of story, one of those fail or first attempts in learning that you've had, where you've gathered a lot of learning or you were able to stand up in an epic story or something similar in that sense. What did you learn? How did you come out of it? Do you have such a story of a fail moment that you would call even your favorite that led you to where you are today?
Actually, I think it's pretty funny that you asked me this because it's one you already know a little bit about. It's the program that I presented at Gamicon last year. So last year, I worked with some of our teams in India for Amazon to design and launch a gamified course for helping teach accent and dialect recognition and understanding. Um, it became a pretty significant learning experience for me because frankly, I didn't do my due diligence. As the first phase of the project, I conducted what I thought was a pretty thorough audience analysis and persona development based on what I knew about our target associates. Things like their ages, their education level, gender distribution, all of those things that you would normally dive into when you were doing audience analysis. Unfortunately, I made some pretty faulty assumptions going in about the overall motivations for the group. I made the biggest assumption that I made was that they were similar to learners in the United States in terms of how they might approach games. For those of you not as familiar, maybe, folks in the United States tend to be pretty competitive when it comes to games, and particularly pretty competitive independently with one another. In this case, it turns out that the folks in India aren't that way so much. They actually work together in a much more cooperative and supportive kind of environment. So building a program like I did that was based on heavy competition and trying to, quote, win the game just wasn't a terribly successful strategy. I think the lesson here was really that I needed to do more research to understand the players. Jonathan Peters of Sententia talks a lot about being aware of self-hugging or creating gamification strategies that kind of match our own particular motivations. And in this particular case, I think that's exactly what happened. I don't think I was as cognizant of what the true motivators were as I could or should have been. And as a result, the program really fell flat for the learners. Though we kind of forced them through the program and we got some success in terms of number of completions, there really wasn't as much success in terms of learning or engagement, and the sort of level one evaluations that we got back from a lot of the learners were not nearly as strong as I had hoped. And when we did a little more of a deep dive with them, what we found out was it really just didn't match kind of the cultural personality, if you will, of the learners. They really just didn't. It didn't resonate with them to have this individual competition. They would have much preferred something that was more cooperative, more supportive of one another, where they could partner and kind of grow that way, rather than try and win at some way. It just wasn't a great experience all the way around.
But I know as well, because we were together, that you were able to turn it around. And why were you able to turn it around? Because you tried, you had this fail, you learned a lot from it, and you were able to change the situation and to understand your learners deeper and to go further with their motivations and to be able to work with them in the future or even in the same project with these new lens. Because the understanding of our learners, of our users, of our players is something that can never be understated. It's always super important, and it's always you can never do enough of that. Even if you feel you've done too much, you can do some more, and it's always going to be useful because you'll find small things, big things that can change your program and that can make it a lot more successful. I don't know if there's, aside from what you mentioned, of course, of knowing more your users, which I completely agree with. Is there anything else you'd like to sort of leave us with from this story?
Well, I think you absolutely hit it right on the head. I think it's all about research, 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 right? And the research shouldn't stop. This is where I kind of failed. The research should not stop once the program is launched. You need to continue to evaluate your program, see how things are going, and if something doesn't seem like it's working quite right, go back and talk to your learners some more and find out what's not resonating for them. Find out how things can be iterated, how you can make changes to really engage them. They are more than happy to talk to you and to share their insights. Believe me, we don't ask our learners frequently enough what they think. And if you just open up and you're willing to listen to some of that feedback and, in fact, listen to some of that criticism, you can really extend your program and make it much better.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now let's make a quick shift into something else that is completely different in that sense, because instead of going for that difficult moment, we would like to know of some story of actual success, something that you would say it's a story that you would be proud of. You set out to do something, had a big challenge, and you overcame it using strategies such as the ones taught to you through Sententia games or any general gamification strategies that you've learned. Can you tell us a story of such a success in Amazon or wherever else, Chuck?
Sure. Sure. So before I came to Amazon, I used to work at one of the largest healthcare organizations in the United States, and it was your very traditional button-down organization with a very serious kind of sober culture. I was brought in to work with them to redesign their new caregiver orientation program, their new hire orientation. As you can imagine, the program they had in place was a lot like you would see at other large scale corporations, the kind of orientation that lasts multiple days, involves a lot of sitting around and listening as leader after leader comes in. They talk about their part of the organization, maybe they show a few slides, and then they leave. And everybody's expected to read a ton of policies, sign some paper saying they received all of the official paperwork. Certainly didn't have any kind of an interaction or any kind of engagement, and the feedback they were getting from their new hires was pretty negative, to say the least. So we spent a lot of time first interviewing different caregivers to get a deeper understanding of what was getting them excited about their jobs and why they wanted to work for this organization, what they really wanted to know as they started in their new roles. And what we found out, and this is not surprising to me, is that almost to a person, they were really driven by the idea of working for something kind of larger than themselves. And the overall mission of the organization really spoke to them. It was very clear that they were motivated by caretaking, idealism, and social contact. Interestingly, even though this was a pretty traditional setting, though, they didn't seem to be very constrained by rules. Even though they were going into the, sort of this formal organization and they recognized that as a sort of a traditional setting, they saw a bigger picture of achieving the organizational mission as their overarching objective. That was what was most important to them. So to get them deeply involved in the orientation, we step back and introduce the orientation as the story of the organization itself. And then we brought them in as characters in this story. What we wanted to do is describe their journey as new caregivers and tie that to how that was part of the larger journey of the organization and how the organization had grown over the last 100+ years. We actually built out a literal map of this journey. And what we were able to do is then create an environment where these new caregivers worked in teams, which was what really mirrored their everyday work structure. And we gave them opportunities during the orientation to take on challenges and puzzles and tasks together as these small teams. And each time they completed a challenge, they got to move forward through the story. The greatest part about what we did, I think, is that even though they started in these small teams, to be able to be successful and to complete the journey, they actually had to work together as a whole. And they figured that out on their own as they went along, that each team had something to contribute and that without everybody's involvement, they simply wouldn't be successful. So they quickly went from trying to compete with one another as these small teams and to win, to recognizing that winning actually meant everybody was able to partner to be successful together. And I think what we were really able to accomplish with that program that made me feel the best was from the very outset, when we very first launched it, the initial moment that a new caregiver started in their role, they began to fully understand and buy into what the organization was all about. They really bought into the culture. It was about as much building a strong organizational bond as it was about giving them any kind of policies and procedures. We figured they were bound to pick those up along the way anyhow. So what was most important was really developing this sense that they were part of a larger whole and that they were part of this organization whose mission was really driving everything that was done and all of the decisions that they made. So it turned out to be just a really outstanding program where people walked away feeling like they were part of something. It wasn't just your standard orientation package. And I think that really led to longer retention times and people really being excited from day one when they started their roles.
And that I want to completely highlight and put the large marker highlight there on the fact that you designed that epic meaning to them because you understood that that was one of the main reasons for them to be there. It was one of their main motivations to even be in this organization was that higher meaning, that epic meaning, understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves, that they were caring for other people. That was, I think, the central. Of course, there were amazing things that you were doing, but understanding that at its core, everything else, being a smart guy like yourself and the great team I'm sure you had as well, everything else started unfolding depending on that. You started creating this story, you put them together in teams because they cared about each other, and you realized that they were actually going to be cooperating. All of those things, in my vision, as I see it from the outside, it seems like they were just unfolding from that initial aha moment that you had because you understood your audience. So that, I think that's an amazing story, Chuck, to tell today. Is there anything else that you would like to highlight from this story?
I think the only other piece I would add, and I just briefly alluded to it, with any program like this, you're always going to be measured on some metric, right? In our case, what they wanted to measure was time to get people into their role and then attrition rates. And though we focused a lot on trying to get people to really buy into this culture of this organization, it all led to better measurable outcomes, right? We had lower attrition rates, we had longer tenure, we had all of these things that from an operational standpoint you would be interested in. But what's important to me is that was not our focus, right? When we built this program, I didn't say, okay, I've got to build a program that's going to lead to lower attrition rates. What we wanted to build was a program that really was going to solidify the caregiver's desire to work in that organization. And the attrition rates were just a natural offspring of that, right? It just kind of happened as a result. And I think sometimes we get so lost in focusing on the metrics that we forget about what sort of the underlying drivers are. And if we can focus on those underlying motivators, the numbers will fall into place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have to know which are the numbers. We have to know which are the objectives. And then, of course, start seeing what underlies in that. How do we get to that metric? What does it mean to have less attrition, for example, in your case? Chuck, you mentioned at the start, we mentioned that you are part of the gamification master craftsman at Sententia Games. So I gather that you probably use at least a part of their process to most of your designs in gamification. Could you briefly describe if you started a gamification project tomorrow, especially for learning, what would be the steps in I don't know, in 2-5 minutes the tops that you would take when you confront that project, when you get started and you follow through until the end?
Sure. I think there are about 5 or 6 consistent steps that I try and use every time. The first one, pretty clearly, understand the problem. And that's, just a matter of really getting down all the facts about what it is you're trying to solve. And as you just mentioned a moment ago, what are those metrics I'm trying to reach? What are the motivators we're trying to use to leverage for that? The second would be understanding the audience. And this is the piece that, unfortunately, we don't always get as detailed as we need to. Really looking into who is the audience that you're going to be serving and what kind of personas do they have that you really should be targeting. Along with that, you want to define the motivations, right? Once I understand the audience, I can understand what are the things that drive them to want to do this program, that drive them to want to learn whatever it is I'm trying to teach them. From there, one of the big things I do in virtually almost every program is write the story. I'm a really big advocate of storytelling in any kind of learning development. And most particularly when you're using gamification, you really want to wrap what you're doing in some sort of story so that people understand where they fit as the player, if you will. Next would be to identify the objectives and the rewards. People like rewards of some sort, right? It could be they win a game. It could be they get a little sticker. It could just be they get a gold star when they're all done. But understanding what those things are that will help them want to drive completion. And then finally, develop the challenges. What are those things? We don't want to just dump a bunch of content on someone. We really want to challenge them to learn the material or challenge them to go through the content in a way that helps make it sticky for them. And then the very last thing, and I cannot say this enough, is test, test, test. You get this done, you roll it out. Maybe you do a pilot with a small group. They test it, they give you feedback. Then eventually you roll it out for real. And as I mentioned before, you want to go back, collect more data, make sure that your learners are really engaging the way you expected them to. Just because they're engaging doesn't mean it's the way that you planned. So really kind of testing and collecting that data so you understand what's going on. And I would just say you just continually iterate after that.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So those 6 steps that Chuck mentioned, always remember you have to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, what's the objective, understand your audience, understand what motivates this audience, understand the rewards or the feedback that you're going to be providing for them, then understand the challenges that they're going to be facing. And finally, and this cannot be stressed enough, play test. You have to check if it's working with real people. It can be a pilot, it can be a small group of the actual audience that you're going to be facing, but test it and iterate. Improve the things that you have, because there's always going to be room for improvement when you face an actual audience. And I would even add, in each and every one of these steps, start trying to face your audience, start trying to see how it works with each and every one of them. When you're trying something, see how it works with that person. Always try to include your audience as much as possible. So that's a fantastic process. Thank you very much for that, Chuck. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And now, Chuck, I would like to know, what is something that you think that in general, like not speaking about a particular project, but that like almost any gamification project, especially for learning, would benefit from using? Something that perhaps you could even call a best practice.
It's going to be a little repetitive maybe, but research, more and more research. When you think you know what's going to interest or engage your learners, dig some more. People will tell you kind of the surface, I'd love to have a gold star, or I'd love to have whatever. But what you really need to get to is sort of those underlying motivators. What are those things that are really going to drive people, not just to complete a training, but to really make it sticky, and what's going to make them want to participate and want to take part in that. And again, just as you were just mentioning, after you're done and you roll it out, do some more research. Go and talk to people. Your learners will talk to you voluntarily. All you need to do is ask, and they will be more than happy to share their viewpoints with you.
Absolutely. I think that cannot be overstated. So Chuck, now we've gotten to probably one of the most difficult questions of the podcast. And I gave you a quick view of that when we started. What would you say, Chuck, is your favorite game?
So I kind of have 2. One is Catan. I love Catan and all of the different variants of that. And for cooperative gaming, I love Pandemic. Pandemic is something that my kids and my family and I have played for a couple of years now, and it never fails to amaze me how many different ways that game can break apart as you're going through, and it can become more and more challenging for you.
Pandemic is an awesome game as well. I've played Catan, not that much, but I have Pandemic at home, and I absolutely love it. It's one of those few games as well that you can really do the 2-player version, and it really works, and it's very, very engaging, and you have 30, 45 minutes, and you win or you lose, but it's over. You can do it again, but it's, I don't know, like those things of these games lately, I really, really enjoy as well. So, Chuck, we also get to this other question that you probably have thought about before when you've listened maybe to other episodes. You say, this was an incredible guest, but I would also like to listen to, and that's the next question. Who would you like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
So I think Kirsten Oberpriller of PentaQuest, her organization is really doing some amazing things with gamification for professional development. They've built some things that I think are pretty unique in the marketplace, and she's just brilliant and a great speaker.
Yes, we met. You met her as well, I guess, in gamification in Gamicon 2018, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, she's from Australia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
So that would be an amazing guest, and it would help us as well try to bring back some more balance and have some more some more of our female guests, which I can't complain.
There you
We've
go.
had quite a few, and they are amazing. But we always want to have more and more amazing female guests as well. So, in that sense of recommendations, Chuck, if you had to recommend one book to our audience, to the engagers, what book would that be and why?
So I think this is going to surprise folks. I'm going to recommend Freakonomics. I know it's not a gamification book, it's not a game design book, but I think what Freakonomics does is it makes you look at things in a new way. If you read some of the chapters in there, they really take a new and fresh perspective and viewpoint on all sorts of topics that you may have thought about for years. And I think anything like that that gets you thinking about new ways of approaching problems or new solutions that you hadn't considered before, that's all gamification is in my perspective. Is how do we approach this current problem that we've done the same way 1,000 times? Is there a different way we can come at it that might be more successful? And I think a book like Freakonomics really kind of gives you, just knocks your brain into a different dimension and makes you think about things a little differently.
Yes, it does. And it's funny because just today I was having coffee with somebody I met over LinkedIn who was traveling here to Spain. And we hadn't met in person, actually. He contacted me through LinkedIn. He's starting to get into gamification and all these things. And I was, for whatever reason, I said, look, what I've observed, at least up until now, is that typically people who get into gamification were before, like in their previous life, were either developers, which is very typical, people who studied, computer engineering, all of these things. It's very typical as well because of the profile, etc. Psychologists and economists for some reason as well, because I guess the behavioral economic side of things is very, very important in this field.
Absolutely.
So, Chuck, what would you say is your superpower in gamification, your sweet spot?
So I think, as I mentioned before, for me, it's all about the storytelling. Long before I was into gamification, interestingly, I ran summer daycare programs for kids age 6 to 12. And one of the things that we did almost every day did just sort of offhand storytelling. We would come up with our own characters, we'd come up with our own plots, and then we would just kind of riff on that for half an hour or so. And I think I've been able to carry that forward into the learning and development work that I've done. And it pairs up so nicely with the gamification world. As I said, I think for me, anything that involves gamification has to have some sort of story around it. And I think I do pretty well on that side.
That's absolutely great and phenomenal. It's very, very useful. We always talk about the theme, the storytelling side of gamification, which is, in my opinion, something that is fundamental. I think that even if it's not explicit, you almost always will need some sort of a story, a theme, something that wraps things around. And now, Chuck, we're going to go into our random question. So we get questions from the audience. Remember that you can always go and either send me an email or go into professorgame.com/question and send us a question for our guests. And the question for this week comes from somebody is not identified, asks not to be identified, and says, I've always loved games, and now that I see gamification is something people are doing as a profession, I am thrilled. Okay, so you are one of our guys or one of our gals as well. Does my love for games help me get started? What do you think, Chuck?
So I think in terms of being able to take that same mindset of being a gamer, whether that's on electronic games or whether it's board games, card games, those sorts of things, all of that is about thinking through rules, thinking through processes, thinking through motivation, being able to take those ideals, those ideas, and pass them on, whether it's to a learning and development sort of role, you can use it in an HR role. I've even seen developers come up with ways of applying gamification motivation strategies to UX design, to website design, to application design. If you look at various apps that are on your phone, 90% of them, even the ones that aren't game apps, are gamified, right? They have some of the same concepts of gamification. So I think absolutely having that background, having that sort of that life experience carries through in a whole lot of different venues.
I absolutely agree. I think it's an experience that you can carry through, and you can think about the things that we think about in gamification, but you do have to make a small shift, and it's not only about, which we still definitely, and I think you agree with me, Chuck, we still definitely enjoy games, but we also include an additional lens when we're playing games. Often, always, sometimes, but we're also looking at games and seeing what's the mechanics, what am I being motivated by, what's my partner being motivated by, what's my adversary as well being motivated by, what's going on when I see in this game. I want to understand it a little bit better and see what I can apply to my own designs as well. So Chuck, it's been absolutely amazing having you today. I've had a lot of fun. I think the engagers will take a lot of things back home to think about, to reflect on, and to in general, to learn from, to apply into their own everyday. Now it's time to say what's the place where we can find you. Let us know if you want to let us know what you're working on, anything public that you want to show, your social media, anything else that you want to let us know where we can find you. If you have any final quick piece of advice, and then we'll say it's game over.
Sure. So my quick piece of advice would be, if you're just getting started in this world, play a lot of games. And just as you just mentioned, when you're playing them, deconstruct them. Think through what is making this game interesting to me. I think once you start kind of getting in that mindset, it carries over into the other work that you do with gamification, right? It really is about kind of identifying, why do I like this game, or why does somebody else like this game, or even better, why doesn't somebody like this game? What are those things that are making this not as engaging for someone? And then lastly, as I mentioned probably 3 or 4 times, talk to your learners. Whatever you do, you've got to get out. You cannot build things in isolation. Build it, roll it out, test it, get feedback, talk to them. They will talk to you if you let them.
You have to let them. That's a key, definitely. Chuck, where can we find you in the world of the internet or in social media? Where if somebody has a burning question to make to Chuck, where can we find you?
Sure. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter as Sigmund Chuck. And you can always email me. Feel free to email me here at Amazon, chucksig@amazon.com. And I'm more than happy to chat gamification with anybody.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for those places. We will have it mostly in the show notes. As I've said before, I don't put the direct email so you don't start getting spam bots. But if you're a human, you will read it and you'll be able to understand that that's an email address. You can find all of this if you go to Professor Game, you type Chuck, you will also find Chuck Coonrat. That's another past guest. You will also find Chuck Sigmund. You could click on Chuck Sigmund and you'll get all the show notes, links to all the things that we've been talking about. You'll find the Twitter account, the LinkedIn account, and the email if you want to email Chuck to get in contact and make those burning questions that you have as well. So Chuck, again, thank you very much for your time, for all your advice, for all those value bombs that you've been dropping today in Professor Game. However, it's now time to say that it's game over.
Thanks, Professor.
Engagers, it's fantastic to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Chuck. Are you using Instagram? I'm posting fairly regularly and would love to connect with you there. Just like on Twitter, my username is RobAlvarezB. If you enjoyed this interview and want some more, I hope you subscribe if you haven't already using your favorite podcast app, and you listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.